You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 22nd of January 2025 on Monocle Radio.
Has Gaza's ceasefire merely moved the conflict to the West Bank? What do we make of Donald Trump's mixed messages on China? And a new study finds the secret to longevity is sheer luck. I'm Chris Chermak. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Chermak. My guests Quentin Peel and Lynn O'Donnell will discuss the day's biggest stories, and we hear from the pavilion makers Hub Culture, who are at the centre of the promenade in Davos. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily, and I'm Chris Chermak. I'm joined today by foreign policy columnist Lynn O'Donnell and by the journalist and regular Monocle Radio contributor Quentin Peel. Hello to you both.
Hi.
Hi. Greetings.
I feel like this show, as many of our shows for this week, of course, there will be a certain Trumpian sort of flow throughout. And given that I have just returned from Washington, D.C., as listeners will know as well, I'm going to start with that for our opening chat. Where were you watching the inauguration? Were you watching the inauguration?
I watched at home on the TV. But the last time he was inaugurated, I was in New York. I was doing a fellowship at Columbia, brag, and there was the Women's March through New York down Fifth Avenue past Trump Tower on that day, and I was with Associated Press, and we weren't allowed to express any political affiliations or views that might have gone along with joining the protest, so I just watched it go past me.
Just
and then
watching.
went shopping.
I was listening because I was driving back from Wales to London, and I swore I wasn't going to listen to it. I didn't want to hear anything of it. It was all so predictable, but you couldn't escape it. So there I was.
You didn't send the car sort of careening at any points to the left
I was
or
a
right,
captive
sort of
audience stuck in a traffic jam.
Well, we will actually start with Gaza because there is a ceasefire that continues to hold there, but perhaps only because Israel has refocused its efforts on the West Bank. Security forces have raided Jenin in what Israel calls a large-scale operation, which also comes as Donald Trump said that he would lift sanctions on Israeli settlers who had attacked Palestinian villages in the West Bank. Quentin, I'll start with you on this. I mean, is this a case almost of this conflict simply moving from Gaza to the West Bank? Is this sort of Bibi Netanyahu's way of placating those cabinet members who didn't want a ceasefire?
I think it certainly is partly that. I think this is part of the rather cynical deal that he's done to keep his hard right parties on board, including in particular one that's led by one of the extreme settlers from the West Bank. But I also think that it actually underlines really the weakness of the Israeli position, because it sort of underlines the fact that they have not destroyed Hamas, and they are now trying to smash up more Hamas sympathizers on the West Bank, where in fact support for Hamas has increased quite dramatically in spite of the fact that they've been having all hell let loose on them in Gaza.
Lynn, I mean, do you get the same sense, I guess, that almost, I mean, when we look at something like this and the fact that, as Quentin says, it's also attacking Hamas sympathizers in the West Bank, I mean, is this a ceasefire as a technicality almost? Is that the way we almost have to look at it?
Well, one thing that ceasefires do is give protagonists an opportunity to regroup, rearm, boost their numbers again. And perhaps this could be looked at as a way of further punishing Hamas to make sure that even though there is a ceasefire in Gaza, that they're not going to get the opportunity to take advantage of ceasefire timing in the West Bank. And I don't know how popular they are really in the West Bank, but I think that, yes, it's a cynical political move by a man who knows that he needs the far-right support in Israel, but also I doubt that it would be an unpopular move to keep on going after Hamas wherever they may be.
Quentin, I did want to bring Donald Trump into this somewhat because he showed a certain, in these first couple of days, almost disinterest in the conflict. There was this comment where he said it is not our war to a group of journalists, and he just kind of wants it to end. But then at the same time, there are cabinet members who will back Israel to the hilt on this, and no doubt we're behind perhaps the lifting of sanctions in the West Bank as well. I wonder what your impression is. Do you think Trump will actually help to ease the situation, or could he inflame it with what he's up to?
As with so many things with Trump, I think, it depends how personally he takes it. So at the one level, I think he wants to go away from all these international situations, whether it's the Middle East or whether it's Ukraine, as I'm going to be the great peacemaker. I'm going to be the US president who next wins a Nobel Prize. On the other hand, I don't think he is fundamentally that interested in it. But I've read descriptions saying he will nonetheless very possibly be the most pro-Israeli president we've seen in the US for decades. So you just don't know. The unpredictable President Trump is keeping us all, in a way, guessing and really scratching our heads.
Lynn, as you mentioned Hamas as well, I mean, as Gazans are returning home, there are some parallels here that I wanted to ask you particularly about with perhaps the Taliban, are there not, and Afghanistan as well. I mean, Hamas has been defeated but not vanquished.
Yeah, well, it was the Trump deal with the Taliban in 2020 that really brought them back into power in Afghanistan. I don't think that that's really arguable, to be honest with you. But the Taliban have behaved very badly, as we know. They've put themselves back into partnership with al-Qaeda, which the United States wanted us all to believe had been decimated beforehand. And they are at the apex of global terrorism and jihadism. They are very close to Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis and the Iranian regime, for whom those other groups are proxies. But what the Taliban have done is I think they have noted, as Quentin has pointed out, the unpredictability of Trump, but they also, because it's in their nature as well, they're transactional. And Trump has already said, we want all the weapons back. We're not giving you any more money. We'll give you a couple of bucks, give us all our weapons back. But it's a completely disingenuous argument, because the Taliban weren't gifted the weapons that everybody says are worth $7 or $8 billion. The weaponry was given to the Republic's military to defend itself, and it failed to do that. And they abandoned all of this equipment when they proved incapable of defending their own country. So I think, I don't know that there are parallels between what's happening in Afghanistan and what's happening in Gaza, but I think the unpredictability of Trump's approach to sticky foreign policy issues is just as relevant here as it is in the Middle East, yeah.
I suppose the only parallel for me, just to follow up on that, was just this concept of, as you say as well, that you cannot really vanquish an ideology if it is that strongly cemented in a society. And that's something that we obviously saw with the Taliban as well. They came back after a war with the US where they were at least somewhat pushed out of Afghanistan. But
well, yeah, you're right. It is ideological. But perhaps it might be seen that some sort of smart way of dealing with the Taliban is also influential on groups like Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis. It remains to be seen, but it's not outside the bounds of imagination.
I think that the thing is, I don't think Donald Trump understands ideology, because he isn't ideological. He understands power, which is why he goes on about exercising power and doing things that will be very visibly showing I'm in power. And I think he thinks he understands fellow autocrats, perhaps, like Putin, like Xi Jinping. And so then he suddenly starts talking about Greenland or Panama. Power is going to be grabbing pieces of land. But he doesn't really understand people who are ideological, which is why I think he wouldn't understand the Taliban and he wouldn't understand Hamas.
Quentin, just one other quick aspect on this, because just in the last sort of couple of hours, it also came out that, speaking of the transactional approach to ceasefires that Trump has, he's also promised or threatened tariffs, taxes, and sanctions if Russia does not end its war in Ukraine. This is his sort of... He believes in the power of transactional diplomacy, doesn't he? But
this is really weird, because what trade does Russia really do with the US? I mean, very little, relatively. They aren't a big source of sort of Russian profits and so on. So actually, it's Europe who needs to, really enforce sanctions against Russia. But I don't know that Trump has got many things in his back pocket. It's actually what he has got is the power to give Putin a seat at the table with him. That both sides would understand. It would flatter their egos, maybe, but not actually saying, oh, we'll slap tariffs and taxes on you and everything else. I don't think Putin cares.
Final word, Lynn, on that. I mean, do you believe this transactional diplomacy has an effect?
I'm with Quentin on this. I don't have anything in my home, and never have, that's made in Russia. I mean, it doesn't affect me, and I'm sure that most Americans would think the same. But yeah, he has no ideology. He understands the power of the dollar bill, but it's all threat until it's not.
Well, we will have more on the Gaza ceasefire on this week's episode of The Foreign Desk, which is airing Saturday at noon. But for now, here on The Daily, let's move on to China, because there probably isn't a more intriguing country to examine in terms of how the freshly inaugurated Donald Trump will manage relations. A China hawk in his first term. The first few days of Donald Trump's second term have been more mixed. Trump delayed the ban on the operation of TikTok in the U.S., held a call with President Xi just before his inauguration, but has also pledged additional tariffs, starting with 10% for its failure to tackle fentanyl. President Xi, meanwhile, has held a call with Russia's Vladimir Putin to firm up that relationship as well. Lynn, do you get the sense that Trump is softening a little bit on China?
China is always a big stick in US election rhetoric, and he knows how to use it well. I think he's right on the fentanyl. It's a huge issue. There's something like 300 Americans die every day from fentanyl overdoses. It's a very, very serious public health issue. And when the Chinese government did ban the production of fentanyl as a sop to America's protests about it, and so the manufacturers of fentanyl just went into production of the inputs. And I think that this is serious. I think Trump will come to understand over a very short period of time that tariffs will hurt ordinary Americans rather than China. But I think the Chinese have to take it very seriously. Their own economy is starting to slip. They're saying that it's 5% now. When I was living in China, it was 8% year after year after year. Wasn't it a miracle? 5% is probably also pie in the sky. I doubt that very much. Xi Jinping's stuff about Taiwan, the saber rattling, is all about taking attention of the Chinese people away from the hardships that they are experiencing. I think that this is one that's going to have to be managed very carefully, because both sides need each other. They always have, and how each of these strong men who see an equal in each other handle it, I think is really going to affect not only America and China, but a lot of us outside both countries too.
And it is a dance, I suppose, at this point, Quentin, and particularly it does come down to this tariffs again, which we were talking about a little bit when it comes to Ukraine and Russia and all these matters as well. This is something that Donald Trump clearly wants to yield, but do you get the sense there too that perhaps it's also whether it's he's softening on China or whether he's softening on the idea of actually imposing tariffs?
Yeah, I mean, Donald Trump is a bit of a bully. We know that. And he does tend to pick on the easy targets first. So who did he instantly say 25% tariffs? Canada and Mexico. But hang on, he went a little bit soft on China because that is a big one. And so I think the Chinese in the first term of Donald Trump did think, I think, we can do business with this guy. He's a businessman. He's transactional. We'll get away with that. But in fact, they then found this unpredictability really quite difficult to deal with. And so I think they've learnt their lesson and they're playing their cards quite coolly and just waiting to see the reality. And I think mention of fentanyl, that is a deal, I think, at the end of the day, they can probably really be seen to do something on. So that's much easier. But if it's the big sort of issues of IT and the whole area and electric cars, all of that. And so now these are issues which the Chinese know there are people all round Donald Trump, like Elon Musk, like all the tech bros, who are much more nervous about him getting nasty on China. So I think that they're playing their cards quite coolly. It's Trump's allies, like the Europeans, who are most nervous about what the hell he's going to do.
Absolutely. Well, one other aspect, Lynn, what do you make of TikTok specifically? Because this has been obviously an interesting side story to all of this. There's been a temporary softening on that too, sort of 75, 90 days for TikTok to basically give up half to the US. That is what Donald Trump has offered. Does he really expect China to follow suit?
Yeah, once again, it's transactional, isn't it? Give us half. It's worth $2 trillion until it's not. You know, I'm the only person I know who's not on TikTok. Oh, okay. Quentin's not on TikTok either. I bet you are, Chris.
Yeah. I'm actually not on TikTok either.
Excellent.
So we have around
100% of people in any room. I don't like TikTok because of, for a whole range of reasons, but mostly I don't like the lack of security, and I think that it's banned in India, for instance, but that's a different. I think that's more geopolitical rivalry than anything else. But I do believe that it's a good move for governments in European countries and in the UK to not allow their civil servants and politicians on it. For instance, to be honest with you, I think that Trump is looking. He's got the 6'9" Baron Trump as his advisor on the under 25 demographic, and that worked very well for him in the election. And I think that he wants to hold on to that popularity. It's all about ego. But to be honest with you, I don't care.
That is one way to end the conversation on TikTok. Quentin, I'm going to pick up another element of what you said, because you did say that Europe is worried, and there are so many aspects as well to Europe and how they should be worried, how they should react, how should they react to the tariffs, and how should they react to China? Are they more or less hawkish on China as a result, perhaps, also of what Donald Trump does to them?
I think they're quite nervous, probably, about finding themselves, if you like, on the same side as China, i.e. being walloped with tariffs by this man who's supposed to be their great ally. So that worries them. They're very worried about what he's going to do about Ukraine, although, as we've already said, it's not entirely clear which way he's going to push, or if he knows how to push on that one. They're really worried, I think, about the way in which he's trying going to pull the rug out from US engagement in the great big multinational organizations, the World Health Organization and the Paris Agreement on climate change. Because if America pulls out of those, it's the Europeans who are going to end up having to pick up the balance and really put a hell of a lot more money into these organizations if they're going to keep the world healthy or keep the world from actually going into a climate cinder oblivion.
Lynn, similar question for the Asia Pacific, I suppose. How are they going to be worried about all of this and kind of the battle between the US and China, as it were? Countries like Australia that have battled China pretty strongly as well on things like tariffs. Do they worry? I don't know. Will Trump sort of take his eye off the ball?
Well, Australia knows as well as anybody how vindictive and punitive China can be when it comes to tariffs. Tariffs on, for instance, barley and wines were pushed sky high. When Australian leaders said things that the Chinese didn't like, when they criticised the Confucian centres, for instance, and the infiltration of Chinese Communist Party apologists, if you like, into tertiary institutions. And so I think that was also one of the things that made the AUKUS deal so popular, and it is quite popular in Australia. Australia and New Zealand both, I think, really have to they've nailed their colours to the wall, and they have to be very careful because trade with China is so important, but it's important on both sides. For Southeast Asia, the rest of the region, I think there is already great caution, and China's intrusions, if you like, or moves to control the South China Sea and the sea lanes there has been very controversial and has made people there very, not only very nervous, but also very aware of their own limitations. But we are in a world in which, China is thin-skinned diplomatically. It's very immature diplomatically, and I think there's still some mileage in it yet. Yeah, it's a wait and see for everybody now.
One of the country that came out in a poll last year as more worried about Trump coming to power than anyone else of those polled was South Korea, really worried about Donald Trump. The country that appeared to be actually most relaxed about Donald Trump coming to power again was India. So it's a funny old balancing act. At Davos, we've just heard the Malaysian trade minister say, this is going to make life really difficult for us. We have big trade with China. This is a very important relationship we have to maintain. We can't suddenly be forced to choose between the US and China. We've got to live with both.
Well, let's move on now to one more completely left field topic for our panel, because if you think you knew the source of longevity and which parts of the world have the oldest populations, Dr. Saul Newman of UCL here in London has written a piece outlining the many falsehoods in longevity research, arguing many of the world's oldest people actually died years before their deaths were officially recorded, and that any correlation between a healthy lifestyle and old age really doesn't show up in any of the data. Lynn, is this the license we've all been looking for to basically just do whatever we want?
That I'll fall asleep in front of an open fire and nobody will notice for 8 years,
It was incredible the way he talked about this as the data, just so many countries are bad at data, or there's the various examples of fraud in order to keep collecting pensions. Yes. I mean, are we tempted by those sorts of things?
What do you do with grandma while you're collecting those pension checks? It's very funny. I guess this is all about really what do you give up? I mean, whenever anybody is interviewed, what's your secret of getting to 101? They always say scotch and cigarettes.
Is that your secret, Quentin? What are you going to say? What is your way you're going to be going to try and reach 101, 110, whatever goal you set in your...
I think the first thing is I'm not at all sure I want to get that far, as I'm sure the oldest person at the table here today. I'm closer to it than any of you are. I'm rather nervous about the fact that in my genes, I mean, my mother lived till 98, my father till 92, so I'm looks set that I might go into my 90s if I'm not careful. And I'm not sure that I really want to, unless I've got all my faculties, unless I'm still reasonably fit. And with my short-term memory starting to wobble a bit, what was I doing for lunch? You worry. I think I've already given up everything I'm going to give up. I'm in the middle of dry January, for goodness sake. And I've stopped smoking, but that was a while ago.
Lynn, is there anything you've given up, or to put it the opposite way, is there anything you're determined not to give up?
Well, I gave up smoking a long time ago, but then I really, really like smoking. So I didn't do anything else during COVID. I'm the only person I know who lost weight during COVID because I stayed at home and smoked. It was great. I loved it. Anything else I'm going to give up? No, not really. No.
I think you would agree with my wife, who says, if I know the world is going to end, I'm going to start smoking.
Go home and tell her that it is.
One other aspect of these that was also at least found to be something of a fraud are these so-called blue zones, the healthy parts of nations where people live longer. This was also exposed as a fraud, but it did lead me to ask you if either of you have been tempted to move somewhere that you think would benefit either your health or your pleasure, for that matter.
You mean follow the Brits to Spain?
If that is the one you're going for.
Yeah.
I've always been tempted to drop out to Ireland as a country that nobody's going to bomb out of existence or anything like that. And I love the sense of humour in Ireland. But having said that, I'm not sure the Irish do live that long because they drink too much and they smoke too much.
They know how to live.
It is interesting the way, Quentin, you were talking about it as well. I do wonder, just finally, not to be slightly philosophical about it, but all of this longevity research, the trends, the focus on it, everything we do, is this just because, despite the luck involved, we just want to try and have some kind of control over our own fates? Do we feel that way?
I think we don't have control over our fate. I think it's all a matter of luck and happenstance. Have you got the right gene, or did the tree not fall on you at the wrong moment? So I'm afraid life is luck. Just seize it if you've got it.
Lynn?
Carpe diem. Yep, seize the day.
Quentin Peel and Lynn O'Donnell, thank you very much for joining us today. And finally on the show, we're off to Davos as the World Economic Forum's annual meeting is well underway. One of the many companies present on the promenade is Hub Culture, boasting several locations with different partners across Davos. They're also the hosts of our pop-up radio studio during WEF, located at the Hub Culture Chalet. And this year, they've added yet another venue to their portfolio, purpose-built for WEF, but with sustainability in mind. Earlier, Monocle's Carlotta Rebello spoke with Stan Staunacker, the founding director of Hub Culture, to find out more about the new building. Carlotta started by asking Stan about Hub Culture's presence in the city.
The Hub Culture Davos Leadership Campus comprises several locations here in the city of Davos, and the chalet is one of our favorite spaces because it's so beautiful and gorgeous, but it's also part of a network of spaces that we do with our partners. So we have the Tech Lodge with MasterCard, focused on advanced AI and financial inclusion. We have the Ice House, which is now going into its 9th year, working with SABIC and McDonough Innovation, and that's focused on innovation for the circular economy. A lot of really seminal moments in the fight for the climate have happened there over the last several years. We have the Terrace with Dell, and this year we have a very exciting new space called the Icon. And this is really the culmination of a lot of time and effort, because we've essentially created what we call a regenerative construction system. And so the Icon represents a space and a new space here in Davos for our partners, but it also represents a big idea about what I call the mid-21st century.
Well, let's delve straight into the Icon, because we visited the building earlier in the week, and it's remarkable. This timber circular construction, it was busy. The 2 times I've been there this week, you almost have to fight to get into the door, which is incredible. You're in a great location. What was your vision behind it?
There's really a lot to the story, but in its most simple form, we have been seeking to create a space that is sustainable, modular, mobile, scalable. And so it begins with our logo. So the logo for Hub Culture is almost 20 years old or more, and it represents 3 levels. So the outer rim of our logo is a blue ring. It represents nature in our mind, in our company. And then the middle segments of our logo represent infrastructure. There are 8 segments. And then the center represents the commons. Now, our goal and our idea has been to build the logo so that imagine if you look at a logo, it can exert a feeling and a frequency. But what if you could walk into the logo? What if you could walk into a space that is proportionally exactly the logo? And so for many years, I've wanted this, but it took us a long time to be able to do it. It's our 3rd building in Davos, but this year we finally achieved it. And so it is proportionally exactly our logo. We found a little space that's just steps from the Congress Center, but kind of invisible to people, and it's covered in trees and snow. And so it's this little nature haven right in the center of the Davos melee. And then the building is made of only steel and timber, and it represents a number of very innovative things in construction. The building is designed with a group called BYLD, which is BYLD, and they are doing some of the most amazing, innovative spaces on the planet in places where nature does not want to be disturbed. And so this building is built on a slope, and it uses screws of steel that go into the earth, but there's no foundations. It doesn't damage the earth. And then the building was built in 9 days on top of it. It represents the ground floor is really a common meeting space, and the upper floor is infrastructure. And it has a beautiful rotunda in the center, and then the top of it is open to the sky. So it has this incredibly wonderful experience when you enter it. It's like going to an inversion, and suddenly you go into summer. So we're in winter, and you enter and you feel like you're in a different type of space.
The construction is remarkable because it does really transport you elsewhere. That skylight and the way you just suddenly feel like you're in a different space, and how much bigger also it feels from the inside because of the way it was designed. And I'm really curious because obviously you're talking here about, being sustainable as a building. And we know that a big conversation that happens during this week at WEF is the fact that so many temporary structures are being put up and the waste and that creates. Mm-hmm. But with the icon, your idea is that, this is just its first stop.
We call it episode 1. And so we're thinking of the icon, imagine a building as a story, and this is episode 1. And so what's kind of remarkable about it is we've created what we call the RCS, the Regenerative Construction System. We don't aim for the building just to be sustainable. We want it to be regenerative. And regenerative is the word of the building. So this is done first with the selection of materials, which are both local and low intensity for carbon, and then offsetting that, working with Hedera. So we're building what we call a physical life and a digital life to the building. The building itself has 32 fractal angles on the outside that condense to 16 segments and then result in 8 pods and then 1 commons. And really the way that I think of this building is in 3 steps. There you have the platform, which is the foundation and the floor. Then you have the pods, and the pods are stackable up to 4 stories. And then you have the facade or the skin. And the skin can come in 6 different types of material. It can be timber, which this one, the outer skin is timber, but it could also be polycarbonate, glass, LED, solar, even battery. And, earlier I mentioned the mid-21st century. So when you say the mid-20th century in architecture, you know exactly what you're thinking of, right? And so my goal and my ambition is that when we think about mid-21st century architecture, this can be an example of that.
Stan Staunecker of Hub Culture there speaking with Carlotta Rebello. The briefing is live at noon tomorrow from Davos. And that's all the time we have for this edition of the Monocle Daily. A big thanks to my panellists, Lynn O'Donnell and Quentin Peel. Today's show was produced by Anita Riotta. Our sound engineer was Elliot Greenfield. I'm Chris Chermak here in London. The Monocle Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.